All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm James Hayashi, the writing advisor for master's students, and this is the APA Formatting and Citations webinar. It's actually the first time we're using the Zoom platform, so I wanted to make sure, can everyone see the PowerPoint on their screen?
Yep.
So periodically I'll pause for questions. So if there's anything, every couple of slides or so, if there's anything that comes up, go ahead and just let me know when we kind of pause for those questions. There's some stuff really quickly that we'll go over on plagiarism, and then we'll get into the actual details of how to avoid it. All right, so as you can hopefully see on the screen, there's a definition of plagiarism from S-Campus, the student handbook. The main thing to keep in mind here, though, is the very last sentence, the last 2 or 3 lines. Plagiarism is considered a grave violation of academic integrity, and the sanctions against it are correspondingly severe. So a couple points on that really quickly, then we'll move on. The first is that is definitely true. All the programs throughout RACIR and throughout USC as a whole definitely take plagiarism seriously. At a minimum, you'll get a 0 on any assignment in which you plagiarize. Anything up to receiving a lowered grade to an F in a class and possibly even being removed from your program. So it is serious. The other side of that, though, is your faculty and your instructors are very careful to make a distinction between what looks like intentional plagiarism and you accidentally forgot to cite one time in a paper. So I'd say it kind of goes in 2 different directions. One is be very vigilant about not plagiarizing. But the other side is, don't be so worried about it that you get an ulcer because, again, your faculty know, especially if you're starting your program, you're getting used to APA, you're not going to do it perfectly the very first time. So do your best to catch up with the rules. And once you have them, you'll be good to go. So, and obviously attending this seminar is kind of a first step in that. So there's different types of plagiarism. What you normally think of as plagiarism, student, using someone else's words or ideas without giving that person permission. There's also having someone significantly edit your work so that it adds or takes away from something that you would have incorporated. You can kind of think of it this way: if someone is significantly contributing to your paper, like a classmate read it and they, significantly edited some parts, if their name does not appear on the title page next to yours, you're not giving that person credit for the work that they did in your paper. The easy way to kind of avoid this is if it's anything beyond just kind of grammatical edits or punctuation, then I would say have the person give you verbal feedback and then you take notes, and then you can decide whether you incorporate those into the paper and how you do that. Otherwise, what could end up happening is if you just, email your classmate the paper, they make some edits, you may not be 100% sure what they've added or what they've taken out, and you're no longer in control of that. So again, if they're going to do anything more substantive than just, fixing commas and reminding you where to put citations, have them give you verbal feedback, and then again, you put in the changes based on what they've said. Lastly, if you improperly cite, like you give the wrong citation so a reader cannot find the original source, that's rare, but that's also considered plagiarism. And lastly, there's also self-plagiarism. Every class within your master's program expects you to come up with new work each time you submit an assignment, unless you have the instructor's consent and say, hey, last semester I wrote a paper on this and I was wondering if I could borrow a paragraph from the introduction. And if your instructor says yes, obviously it's fine. Other than that, though, again, every time you submit an assignment, it should be new work because you're getting new credits for that assignment and for the units of the class. So you have to do the creation of new academic material each time you're submitting. If there's no questions on that, any of the types of plagiarism, then we'll go ahead and move on. Doesn't look like there's anything. Okay, so all right. So really quickly, quoting versus paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is, of course, using your own language to express someone else's ideas. The advantages include it forces you to understand what you're writing because you're putting in your own words. It also demonstrates to your instructor that you understand it because you're able to synthesize it in new language. And lastly, it's just more aesthetically pleasing than seeing a bunch of quotation marks all over the page. I would put a fourth one on here. It's kind of the default mode for academia is to paraphrase rather than to quote. I did a very informal kind of survey of a bunch of assignments that students were instructed to read, professionally published academic material, and it was about somewhere around 80 to 85% of the material was paraphrased when it was cited, and only 15% or so was directly quoted, which is to say, again, the readers that you'll be reading, their dominant mode of citation is paraphrase. It's just what's done in academia. A quote is okay, there's nothing wrong with it, but you want to make sure there's a reason. Again, the default mode should be paraphrase, and you can, unless you have a reason to quote, such as if you need the exact language, like if you're at a site and you're observing a student and you wonder if the student has a particular learning disability, you might quote the definition of that learning disability to make sure you get it right, and then determine whether or not that student meets that criteria. If there's something really eloquent about the paraphrase, about the original, and you would lose it in a paraphrase, then obviously a quote might be more appropriate. Or if it's from a really famous or well-known authority in the field of education, and you feel it just has more weight to a quote because it's the famous authority's own words, then that's another instance in which you might quote. Otherwise, again, paraphrasing should just be kind of what you're generally doing. Paraphrase material still has to be cited, and we'll go over that in a subsequent slide. So just really quickly, because I've seen some problems with this, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see an original text, and on the right side, you'll see a plagiarized version of it, which would be considered plagiarism, even though you'll note at the bottom, we've cited the author's name, the publication year, and the page number of this information. This is still too close to the original. You don't have to read through the whole thing, but if you compare, I've color-coded it so you can see the original says during the 1980s, and that becomes in the 1980s. CLT became such a dominant force, turns into CLT grew into a dominating force, or something like a steady stream of scholarly books becomes a regular flow of academic books. And so what you can kind of tell what happened here is the right side version, what a writer probably did is looked at the left side, kind of typed out 2 or 3 words, looked at the left side again, typed out another little phrase, 3 or 4 words at a time, coming up with synonyms. But the sentence structure is identical, right? That's why those color codes match so neatly. And then every other word, they just replace it with a synonym. Again, that's too close to the original to really count as a true paraphrase. What's a better idea if you're going to paraphrase this much information is to read it 2 or 3 sentences or half a paragraph at a time. Think about what you remember, and then type that out. Because it's really hard to kind of memorize a whole paragraph or half of a paragraph and type that all out. What's more likely is you're going to remember the main parts, and then you'll type them out in your own words. So again, looking at sentences and paragraphs at a time as opposed to 2 or 3 words and typing that out, because again, what you'll end up is probably like what you see on the right side. What's preferable, you don't when you get the recording of this, which you can get, you should get automatically. If you don't, actually, let me give my email. Give me 1 second to see if I can put that in. Okay, so you should have gotten a message from me in the group chat. That's my email. If you do not receive a recording of this in the next couple of days, I think it should automatically go out. But if not, go ahead and email me, and I'll send you the link. It usually takes about 24 hours to process, so you may not get it until tomorrow or over the weekend. But if not, you can shoot me an email. And when you look at that, rewatch the video, you'll see, and if you compare the left side and the right side, it's the same ideas, but the language is significantly different. A couple of things I'll point out, though, is you can see on the right side there is a quote, a steady stream of scholarly books. And this is not an APA rule, but a general suggestion or a guideline I give to help students avoid plagiarism is if you're quoting more than, like, say, 4 consecutive words, putting quotation marks around that is just good practice. Obviously, 2 or 3 words, you may happen to use those the same as the author. But if it's more than 4, like 5 words or more in a row, putting quotation marks around it and giving the page number where that quote is found is good practice, just to indemnify yourself against, the possible accusation of plagiarism. And again, in a later slide, we'll go over exactly how the citation has to look. But are there any questions on paraphrasing or quoting right now? Doesn't look like it, so I'll go on. Okay, so integrating quotes. This next part is really, we'll go through it quickly. It's more of a style point than a true APA rule. But in general, since you are in graduate school, kind of elevating your writing to a more sophisticated level, avoid floating quotes. That is a quote that's kind of just dropped in. Like here, you can see, you can, without even reading it, you'll just see there's a sentence, right, a period, and then some quoted material, another period, and then it ends with another student sentence. So student sentence, period, quoted material, period, and then back to the student's sentences. This is technically correct. The quotation marks are given to identify where the quote begins and ends. There's the author's name, year, and page number. But you can see it just has a very choppy feel. Again, without even reading it, it's like my sentence, period, quote, period, back to my sentence, period. So to avoid this kind of choppiness, which again stylistically isn't ideal, you can integrate it better, and you'll see that on the next slide. So you can use a simple signal phrase like saying who said this or who wrote it, like language expert and Harvard professor of psychology Steven Pinker should be wrote, and then the quote. Right? So you can see it flows more smoothly from the student material into the quoted material, just saying the name of the author, the name of the scholar, and then that person hypothesized or stated or theorized. Another actually more common way to do this is to paraphrase the first half of the sentence and then directly give a quote for the second half. You'll see that here. Like Pinker explained that contrary to conventional wisdom, language is no more cultural invention than is upright posture. So again, the first part of the quote is paraphrased, and that leads directly to the second half, which is the direct quote. Just to reiterate, the slide you saw on the material on the previous slide is technically right, but just stylistically, it's better to integrate the quote, more smoothly into your own writing. Oh, sorry, I see that there's a chat from Dave, and he asks, is there a group chat available somewhere after the lecture? Oh, is the group chat available somewhere after the lecture? That's a great question. It's housed in the recording, but other than that, I don't think it comes as a separate file or a separate document, Dave. So if you're asking because you want my email, the best thing to do, and this is for everyone, is to write it down, or if you know how to copy and paste, it's either Control-C and then Control-V to paste it, or if you have a Mac, I think it's that Function key C and then Function key V to cut and paste. Or you can obviously just write it down. In addition to getting the recording and emailing me for that, if any of you have a writing question, like, James, does the sentence look right? Or I'm not sure if I cited this properly. You can always email me with those types of questions. Unless you're referred for individual writing advising, I don't look at like whole papers because there's 600 or 700 master students and only one of me, so I can't look at everyone's papers unless an instructor refers you for extra help. But I can definitely answer questions and also look at a couple sentences to even maybe like a paragraph or so of writing if you have something that you're worried about or wondering. So again, my email is handy for more than just getting the recording link. It's if you have other writing related questions in the future. Okay, so just as general guidelines, not as hard and fast rules. Generally speaking, try not to begin or end a paragraph with a quote. When you begin with a quote, you can't integrate it or set it up the way we just saw in the previous slide, where you paraphrase the first half or you give the speaker's name. It gives the reader more context when you do those things, which is good. So try not to begin a paragraph with a quotation. Similarly, if you end with a quotation, You can't explain its significance, and that's what you want to do to have control over the quote. You kind of don't leave the reader to their own devices to figure out what the quote means, unless it's very self-explanatory. It's always best practice, I think, to explain the quote and show how it's related to your main points. So the actual formatting, what probably most of you are wondering about. If your quote is fewer than 40 words, you can incorporate it into your own sentence. So you'll place double quotation marks around it, which you've been seeing throughout these slides. And then you'll punctuate after the close quotation mark. So just look at this example. If you look at the example, you'll see the period does not happen inside the quote, and it doesn't happen right after the quote either. It's all the way after the citation. So again, the final period, it's not inside the quote, it's not right after, it's all the way after that parenthetical citation. Those are pretty much the only rules. It's pretty simple. Double quotation marks and period at the very, very end. If there's no other questions on that, we'll keep going. Let's see. Give me 1 second. So normally, I might have mentioned this already. This is the first time we're using the Zoom platform. So I'm sort of getting acquainted with some of its features as well. I don't see, as I'm looking through like my options, that I can share a file with you. So what I'm actually going to suggest, because I normally have a few handouts, they're not necessary, but I think they're really helpful. So if you haven't already done so, go ahead and copy my email from the group chat. And at some point right now or during the course of the evening, go ahead and email me and say, hi, my name is so-and-so. I was in the APA recording. I'd like the handouts. And I can email them to you. I'll just respond and send you the handouts, and I'll tell you what they are. One of them is it's a document on how to do the references section, sometimes referred to as, it's like a bibliography or works cited if you're from MLA background. We don't cover that because it's pretty easy. So I just give you, there's a handout you can follow for that. It's not difficult. So the handout kind of covers the references of the bibliography, how that works. There's another handout I have that explains headings, like if it's a primary, a main heading, what does that look like? If it's a subheading, what does that look like? Or a sub-subheading. Another of authors, because if you get more than 3 authors, how to cite that. There's also one, if any of you do come from an MLA background, I have a document that compares MLA versus APA. So it shows you all the differences in formatting. Anything that's not listed there is the same. So you only need to focus on the things on the handout that you're learning or relearning, and anything else would be the same in terms of formatting. Okay, so again, if you'd like those handouts, go ahead and copy my email. Send me an email, and then I'll send you those attachments. Okay, and if there are no questions on like these short quotes of fewer than 40 words, we'll move on to block quoting, the longer quotes. So block quote is for 40 words or longer. The rules are: you'll start the quote on a whole new line. You'll indent it a ½ inch, the same as like a new paragraph indentation on the left-hand side, but the right-hand side is the same. There's no changes to the right. The block quote will be double spaced, and I know if you come from a different background, you might be used to single spacing your block quotes, but everything is double spaced in APA. From the title page all the way through the end of the references, everything's evenly double spaced. There's no quotation marks, and you still will give the author's name, year, page number. You'll see all that in a second. But okay, so here you can see the top half is this, we'll call it the student writing, and the quote begins at this indented part. If I can, okay, so here we go. So here's the student writing. The block quote begins here. You can see it starts in a new line. You'll notice that there's no quotation marks around it. The whole thing is indented. The whole thing, we'll call it double spaced, just because it was hard to get everything on one slide. So you can see the spacing is the same here as it is here. It's not different. We've given the author's name here, Pinker. We've given the year, and we've given the page numbers at the very end. One thing that is a little bit different from block quote, and most of your instructors probably don't actually really care about this, but if you really want to follow the rules and do it correctly, the period does come before the page number and only in block quote. I know I just told you normally it would come like over here at the end of the parenthetical, but instead it's here right before the parentheses for block quote. Again, starts a new line. The whole left side is indented. No quotation marks. The period comes before the parentheses. Those are the main rules for block quoting. And again, this is only if your quote is of 40 words or longer. Questions on block quotes? Doesn't look like it, so we'll keep going. Okay, so most of you know if you remove material from a quote because you don't need, like, it's a really long quote, you just need the beginning and the ending of it. There's stuff in the middle you don't want. You can take it out by using ellipsis or that dot dot dot, just like right here. Some people also put brackets around the ellipsis to show the ellipsis is yours. It's not in the original text. It is possible. Sometimes writers will put ellipsis in themselves, so putting the brackets around it indicates you've taken something out and replaced it with the ellipsis. But it's optional. You don't need the brackets. Of course, you can also. Well, that's the next slide. What should I do? So let's see. Yeah. So if you do change anything, you also use the brackets. Like if you change pronouns like I to he, or you need to change a verb number or verb tense, those types of little changes you can make. Just put them in brackets also. And note, as that bottom part says, these changes don't alter or distort the original meaning. Like you wouldn't take out the word not or put in a word that completely changes the original meaning. Just to help integrate the quotes better into your own sentences. And with that said, we'll go back to these parts. The only time in APA, the only time when you use single quotation marks, as you can see here, is if you have a main quote, which is with double quotation marks, and then you're quoting someone who's quoting someone else internally. So this example says, language expert and Harvard professor of psychology Steven Pinker wrote, language is not, as Chomsky claims, a mere cultural invention. So that phrase, cultural invention, Pinker is quoting Chomsky, so that interior quote gets single, and the main quote on the outside gets double quotation marks. So again, that's the only time in APA you use single quotation marks. Not so common. Even less common is using SIC, S-I-C, italicized and bracketed to indicate that there's a mistake and you're directly quoting the mistake. So here you'll see, Hessing noted that many of the participants were unable to complete their surveys. Of course, this should be T-H-E-I-R, but theoretically, if you saw that and you're quoting it directly, you would put SIC, italicized and bracketed right after the mistake to indicate you quoted the mistake. It's not a typo on your part. Questions on SIC, on ellipsis, on brackets? Okay, if not, then a little bit more on citation formatting. So again, citing is for any words or ideas that aren't your own. You always give the author's name or the organization's name of publication and the year of publication. So APA is sometimes called the author date system because we always give the author and the date and a minimum. If you don't know the date, you use ND, which you can think of as like no date. And there's a couple ways to provide this information. We'll see that on the next slide. But always author and date at the very minimum. So here you can see, okay. In 2003, Kessler study showed, so this is incorporating the year and the author's name into your sentence. This top one is the least common, but totally acceptable according to APA. So putting both the author's name and the year into your own sentence. You could also throw everything in parentheses at the very end, like early onset results in a more persistent and severe course, and then in parentheses, author's name, year. You could also just mention the author and then put the year in parentheses right after that name. So Kessler found that among epidemiological samples, blah, blah, blah. These bottom two are the most common. I think the middle one is probably the easiest because you don't really think about where everything's going just at the end in parentheses. You could also, again, mention the author's name and give the year parenthetically right after, or incorporate both pieces into your sentence as shown there. And this system is for paraphrase. When there's not a direct quote, we always give just the year and the author's name. So this slide is basically just saying, if there are not, this is very rare, but if there are no page numbers for something you're looking at, you can give the paragraph number instead, as you can see right there. Okay. So if you're doing a direct quote, you also need the page number. And if you're doing everything parenthetically, that would be author, year, page number in that order. And commas, not periods or semicolons, always separate that information. Okay, so for direct quote again, author, year, page number. But that can be given several ways. So like this, again, the simplest way, everything in parentheses for a direct quote, it's author, then the year, then the page number. You can also do it the other way that we saw earlier in 2003 Kessler study. Then the page number would come at the end. It's not here, but it would be in parentheses at the very end if you had a quote, the page number there. Okay. Also, if you don't know the author isn't listed, normally there's an organization or group that's published the material, either the group's website or the group's publication, print publication. So you'll give that, and you'll give it with the year, not the web address. I know some systems use like a web address and the year, or the name of the study and the year, depending on what you're, if you use a form or a citation system. But for AP, it's always author and date. There's no questions on any of that so far. I think Dave might be raising his hand. Dave, do you have another question?
Oh, yes, I do. What I'm wondering is, and you may be going to discuss this later, but if you wanted to include either an entire figure or a portion of a figure that you obtained from a source like on the, for example, on the internet, could you discuss the correct way of attributing or giving or noting the source for those types of things?
So like a figure from the internet?
It would be, for example, a graphic. So I am learning to be a mathematics teacher. So occasionally I will find a very interesting way of showing a picture that describes a proof, and to be able to do clip art or clip that from a web page and include it with attribution would be what I would want to try to do.
Okay, that's a good question. So in the there's two parts. There's always two parts where you have to cite. One is in the body of your paper. So in the body, if there's it's a math teacher's web page and his or her name appears somewhere on the page and you know who it is, then you cite the person's name. And if there's no, sometimes if it's a blog, maybe they may have a year, right? Like what 2018 or 19. So then it's just a normal looking citation. If there is no individual name, then the blog or the web address or the website may have a name like math teacher's blog or mathematics website or whatever the name. Hopefully something more creative than that. But you would give the name of the website, like the name of the group, not the actual URL. And then again, if there is no year on it, then you would just put ND for no date. That's in the. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's perfect. What I was wondering was, at least in my research, what I've seen is, for example, a web source will have perhaps a complex diagram that's been created by someone, but a portion of that diagram exactly amplifies the point I want to make. So what I may want to do is to clip a section of the larger diagram, sort of a close-up of a piece of it, and use that to illustrate the point that I'm making. And what I'd like to be able to do is to use that technique. Perhaps it's a colorful example or a very novel graphic to show something that instead of using a complex equation, they might use a colorful picture to show that. To be able to just snip that portion of someone else's work, include it, but give attribution.
So then within the body of your text, when you're about to reference it and say like a sample of the graphic appears here, so you would just put that in the explanation in the
Okay.
body, something like this is a like yeah, this is a sample, or this is an excerpt of a larger diagram, or this is an excerpt of a larger graphic.
Perfect.
Then the reader would just know it's not the entire thing, it's just a portion of it.
Great, that helps. Thank you very much.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, then we'll move on. So secondary source, we should talk about what a primary source is. A primary source is the first person to define a term, to conduct original research, to do a study, to come up with new scholarship, new knowledge. That's why it's called primary source. A secondary source is someone who cites the original. So if you're reading, and like you're reading Dr. Smith, and Dr. Smith quotes Johnson, Johnson is the primary, you're reading Smith, who's the secondary source. It's always best to go back to the primary source if you can. The secondary author may have misquoted. There might be an accidental typo in that secondary source. They may have, what's most likely is they may have kind of skewed their paraphrase, but they'll skew the information to make it fit more with their theory or their own ideas. So whenever possible, go back to the original and look it up. Maybe you can't though, like there's not enough time, it's 10 minutes before your assignment is due, or you just can't find the original, it's not in a language that you understand. In that case, you'll do this. In your reference list, like your bibliography, you'll give the secondary source because that was your reference. But in the body of your paper, you'll name the original work and cite the secondary source, and we'll see how to do that on the next slide. But again, your references or your works cited paper, you'll give what was your reference, the secondary source, but you mentioned both in the body of your paper. So if you have Jacobi and Myers, they were the secondary source, and they were citing Flaubert, the original, you might write something like this. According to the original source, as cited in secondary authors, secondary year, and then blah, 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 the idea. So again, according to the original, and then in parentheses, as cited in secondary source, secondary year, and then the content. So that is actually maybe more common than you might think, because you'll be reading a lot of secondary scholarship, someone who's summarizing a whole bunch of different people's ideas. So the author you're actually reading might be citing or quoting many different other scholars. So that comes in handy when that happens. If there's no questions on secondary or primary sources, okay. Then a few things to avoid. We'll go through these really quickly. Don't use large chunks of quotation, especially like block quotes, just to fill space. Your graduate school instructors know that this is not your own scholarship. It's just you quoting someone else, which is really easy, right? With that cut and paste feature, you're not even typing it out necessarily. You can just be cutting and pasting it from someone else. Again, just a guideline, not a rule. But I would say within a typical 5-ish page paper, you might have one block quote maximum. Maybe you might have 0. But if you have more than one block quote in a 5-page paper, you really need to ask yourself, do I have to quote this, or could I paraphrase it? So don't use large quotes or too many quotes if it's not necessary. You also don't have to cite after every single sentence. You can see here, just in that I've colored it. After every sentence, the student has cited the same person of communication, or the same interview. It just looks a little bit cluttered. What's easier on your reader, but a little more work on you, is if you did this. That is, if you write the paragraph or the information in such a way that the reader can tell it's all from the same source. So for example, Principal Darmoudi maintained that blah, 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 blah. Here you can see, and then after the first sentence, we've cited it. Personal communication, which is what you'll say for an interview or an email, and then the exact date, the full date of that personal communication or interview. The school, he continued, so we know that's from that same interview. It's the same person continuing. For instance, so here's an example of what he said. In addition, his school theater group, so that indicates his school is the principal school. So it's clear that it's from that, again, from the same source. And then you can see we've also cited the last sentence of the section, author, personal communication, and then the date of that communication. So what we have is a bookend. The first sentence and the last sentence have been marked or cited, and then everything in the middle is written so we can tell it comes from the same source, from the same interview. Again, it's more work, but you can see it's a much cleaner look than the previous sentence where every single sentence is cited. One thing to keep in mind is the purpose of citation is twofold. It's to give credit to the original author, and it's to make it possible for your reader to look up the original information if he or she chooses. So you don't have to cite after every single sentence as long as it's clear where the information came from and it's possible for your reader to find it based on your references and your citations. Okay, so sometimes you'll have to do an interview, maybe with a parent, a teacher, or a principal, and you'll be asked to type out the transcript of those interviews. When you have that, you don't need to put every, or sorry, that's the next slide. For this one, I've seen something like this where someone was typing out an interview and there was no punctuation. You'll notice there's none in like what is 8 or 9 lines of text until the very end. And I said, how come there's no punctuation? And the student said, because the person didn't pause, so I didn't put anything in. It's the your interviewees are not going to tell you like period, comma, semicolon. It's your job when you're transcribing to add punctuation so that it's grammatical and understandable to your reader. Even if your interviewee did not pause, you put in punctuation again so your reader can understand where the main ideas are. Similarly, when you're transcribing, you don't have to put every or into the transcript. So I saw something like this. So the principal, he was like, this is not necessary. It's correct to remove those placeholders from the transcript. And you don't need ellipsis. You can just pull them right out. It makes it much easier for your readers. The one exception I might say is if you feel like the person you're interviewing seemed very uncertain or unclear or hesitant in his or her answers, then including things like uhs, or pauses, that might communicate that to your reader. But unless that's the effect you're going for, you can just pull them all out. Okay. So the colon to introduce a list, you can see there's an example that's correct and incorrect. The correct one, you use a complete sentence when you're introducing a list. So there are several uses for the colon, the complete sentence, and then here we list them out, right? The uses for the colon are, this is obviously not, this is not normally a complete sentence. The uses for the colon are, is not a complete sentence. So again, when you're introducing some kind of list with the colon, use a complete sentence. Another example, types of menus include the following, a complete sentence. Types of menus include, not a complete sentence. Any questions on that stuff? All right, if not. Then this is the very last thing, and then we can kind of open it up to general questions. But APA numbering, this can also be a little bit tricky. So if you're interested in this in particular, you can also email me. I have a special, like a little blog entry. We have a weekly writing tip that comes up, and one of the writing tips was on APA numbering. So if you're really interested in this, or you feel like maybe because you're a math candidate and you feel like you'll be writing about numbers a lot, I have a little blog that goes a little bit more in depth on this. But for most people, this will be sufficient. So you use numbers or numerals for any number 10 or greater. For any number that's right before a unit of measurement, like 13 centimeters or 7.5 years. Percentages, ratios, and percentiles. And then anytime you're dealing with time, dates, or ages, you'll use numbers, normal Arabic numerals. Conversely, though, you'll type out or spell out numbers for any number that begins a sentence, title, or heading. So for example, 48% of the sample, even though it's a percentage, because this is the beginning, we spell it out in words. So 48% of the sample showed an increase, 2% showed no change. This is the middle of the sentence, and it's a percentage, so we give it as the number. 23 students improved, and 15 students did not. So 23 begins a sentence, so we have to spell it out. 15 is a number greater than 10, or 10 or greater, so we give it as a numeral. Common fractions like a 2/3 majority or 1/5 of the class are spelled out, and then numbers 0 to 9 are also spelled out. So again, those are just the rules for formatting numbers. Most of your instructors are not super particular about that. Maybe this rule, like anytime you begin a sentence with a number, spell it out. But other than that, this is kind of a more minor point. The biggest things obviously are the citations. You want to get that right because that could significantly affect your paper and your grade. The rest of the stuff, it's important, but not as important. So that's the official end of all the APA stuff. If you have other questions, we can take them now. As you're formulating your questions, I'll just let you know. At this time next week, Thursday, 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific, we'll have our Introduction to Graduate Writing webinar. So if that interests you, we'll cover things like the writing process, like the stages of writing, how to use the steps of writing to create the best possible product, tips on how to become a better self-editor, tips on brainstorming. We talk about common grammatical errors that I see. Those are the main things that we highlight there. So yeah, if you're interested, that's next week. And then let me see if I can find the week after that what we're covering. In 2 weeks, we'll do. Sorry. 2 weeks is academic style. So that one is obviously style. It's less about right and wrong, but it's more tips on what does graduate school expect of you in your writing style-wise, as opposed to just grammar and APA rules. It's more with the quality of your sentences, the way they look, how do you vary sentence structure to make your paper sound interesting. And then February 7th, we have our paragraphing webinar. So that's things like how do you write a good introduction, how do you write a good conclusion, how do you structure a paragraph and integrate evidence into it effectively, all that type of stuff. But I guess the main one is, again, next week, Introduction to Grad Writing. Are there any other? I think there's a hand. So Dave, you have another question or comment?
Yes, it has to do with using internet link identifiers as part of your attribution. In my experience, those are subject to change. They're sometimes called URLs, and those are subject to change, which makes them rather fluid in terms of if you cite them and they change, when people click on them later, they'll find it's an invalid link. Do you have any guidance regarding this subject?
So that's a great question. Are you familiar with DOIs?
I am.
Okay, so the for everyone else, the DOI stands for Digital Object Identifier. It's a permanent link. So even if, like, I published a blog, if I had a DOI for a particular article, even if I delete the blog or it goes away, the digital object identifier makes it permanent, and someone can always access it, even if that article is no longer technically there. It's a string of numbers. It's not like a www dot. So if where that comes in, where that comes into play is on the references site or the works cited. So again, in the body of the paper, you never give the URL or the DOI. But in your references page, the bibliography, you can. It's preferable to give the DOI for that reason. That if your paper is found in 5 or 10 years, all your links will still work. So if a website has a DOI, it's preferable to use that. And the document I'll send you that explains how to do references shows you the exact order of how the pieces should go. If not, though, there's no you don't have an option if you use an online source and there is no DOI, you just have to give the URL address. A couple of things from your end and from the reader's end. If if you're using an online periodical, but it also comes out in print, and you'd really like someone to be able to find the information you had, you can give the print edition, right? In your references section, give the information as a print document as opposed to the web address, and then obviously someone can find it provided they have access to that journal. And from the back end, usually from the reader's end, normally, if you've given the citation information correctly, even if your web address doesn't work, if there is a print edition of that newspaper or book or journal article, a reader will still be able to find the print edition. So again, even if the web address is gone, they can't find it. If you've given the information correctly, they should be able to find the hard copy and use it that way. So yeah, again, giving the DOI is preferable. Not all web pages have them. If they don't, then you can give the web address anyways, and again, your reader will be able to find the print copy if it exists. Yeah, that's a really good question. No one's ever asked about that. Any other questions on citations, APA stuff, other writing related stuff? Okay, doesn't look like. Oh, sorry. Cecilia says, does the works cited page differ from the reference page? Okay, so if so, when do you use each one? Okay, so the works cited, I believe that's the name that MLA uses. They're both the bibliography page. They're both just the bibliography. The references page is what we call it for APA. In fact, one of the documents, if you emailed me, I'll email you back a document that's a sample APA paper, so you can see exactly what all the sections are supposed to be called. Like it's called references and not works cited. So yeah, the works cited page is for MLA. It is formatted in a certain way, very similar to the references page for APA. But again, if you emailed me, then I'll send you a document that shows kind of how you each main type of art, whether it's a book, a chapter in a book, a newspaper, a journal article, how you would cite it. And Cecilia also asked, how do you cite videos or reporters in videos? That's a great question. So in the in the body of your paper, you would give the name of the publisher of the video and the year it was published. If you don't know the year, then obviously again you use ND. And then in the references section, that's a little bit more involved, but the document I'll send you, it'll show you examples. It'll have examples of videos, the most common resources you'll use, including online videos, how you would cite those. And since you asked, just remember, you can see it's the blue, the 6th edition, the APA manual, and again, it's the blue one. It's a required text for all of your classes, so if you haven't already ordered it, be sure to pick one up. You'll need it for basically every class in your program, no matter what program you're in. In addition to giving you some details on formatting and all that kind of stuff, it also has a section on style, some tips on how to be a better writer. It has a grammar section that can be useful if you struggle with grammar. It has a bunch of stuff you won't need because it's mostly for publication, which is why it's called a publication manual. And I know that you all are just using it for homework. But it's still, again, it's a very handy book and it's also required. Like it's the 6th edition, don't get the 5th because that's outdated. But back to Cecilia's question. Yeah, Cecilia, I'll send you a document and it'll it'll give you an example of what the video citation should look like. And that I think that's always sufficient for students to see the example and they know how to format it. You're welcome. If there's are there any other questions? Okay, so hopefully everyone copied down, again, my email address. Something else may come up later tonight or next week. As questions arise, again, feel free to email me. Yeah, again, next week at the same time, we'll have our Intro to Grad Writing webinar. So if you're interested in that, come back to the same link, same time. Otherwise, hopefully we'll see you guys next week. Let me see. I'm having some problems with my mouse. So we're officially done. So you can go ahead and go. I'm gonna try and close out. Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to